Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Victim's Voice. I'm your host, Lorelei. For the next 5 weeks, we are going to dive deep into a case out of West Carroll Parish in Louisiana. This case is about a family fighting for answers and for justice for their loved one, Crystal McCrory Jones. Crystal's death was ruled a suicide from the very beginning, within an hour and 45 minutes of her body being discovered. This led to almost no investigation taking place. From the beginning, Crystal's family had their suspicions that something more nefarious had happened to her. And after digging deeper and doing their own investigating, they found evidence that tells a completely different story than what the authorities were saying. However, in a small town where law enforcement has a good old boys mentality and would rather protect each other than the people they took an oath to protect, it's hard to uncover the truth. But Crystal's sister Jana is a badass and has not given up on finding the truth about what happened to Crystal. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to go over the timeline from the beginning and what Jana has done in the last 3 years, and also all of the inconsistencies and discrepancies that she uncovered in the documents during that time. Crystal's family vows that they will continue fighting for the truth into what really happened on that day in February 2023, and hope that the person responsible for Crystal's death is eventually held accountable. But to get to the present, we have to go back to the beginning. So, with that said, let's go ahead and dive in. Crystal McCrory was born on May 17th, 1979, in Crossett, Arkansas, to parents Janie McGilton and Doyle Dwayne McCrory. Crystal was the second oldest of four children. Dane, her brother, was 4 years older, and her twin siblings, Jana and Josh, were 10 years younger. Because of the age gap, Crystal was like a second mother to Jana and Josh. She loved them and protected them as if they were her own living, breathing baby dolls. As Jana became a teenager, she looked up to her big sister Crystal, who showed her all things girly, like how to straighten her hair and put on makeup. Crystal had a laugh that would fill any room with joy and a personality that would make anyone feel safe and loved. She was the kind of person that knew how to make everyone around her feel special, whether it be with a thoughtful gift or an encouraging word. She loved to make people laugh by telling silly jokes or by pulling a prank. Jana said that Crystal was the biggest prankster that she knew. And let's talk about the gift giving. Crystal didn't just give gifts on birthdays and Christmas. She gave them for every occasion or no occasion at all. Out of the four siblings, Jana was the only one to have girls, so Aunt Crystal spoiled them rotten. If one of them lost a tooth, they got a gift. And it wasn't just a little gift either. Jana's youngest daughter even wanted Aunt Crystal to adopt her because she was such an awesome gift giver. Crystal had what people would say was a type A personality. She loved doing everything to perfection, from her appearance to her home. Everything had to be put together and look its best. She also was an amazing organizer. She loved to organize so much so that it was like her own personal therapy. On top of that, she was a talented party planner, an amazing cook, and knew how to decorate a house to make it feel like a home. Crystal was admittedly a little high strung, while still having a lovable and likable personality. Crystal was so type A that she only used white hangers to hang her clothes on, which leads to a funny story. One day, Jana thought it would be funny to switch all of Crystal's white hangers to colored hangers. Crystal was so mad that all she could do was laugh. She did take Jana's house key away for a while, but gave it back a week later. This shows just what kind of person Crystal was. She strived for perfection and never wanted to be complacent in life. She was always trying to better herself and move up the ladder, whatever the ladder may be at the time. Crystal's favorite song was Fancy by Reba McEntire because she felt it represented her life. Her family didn't have a lot of money when she was growing up, but she worked hard to better herself. One thing Crystal couldn't do was pass up a good deal. She loved going to thrift stores, Dollar General, and Dollar Tree, but her main thing was couponing. It was a rush to see how much she could get from a store for the least amount of money. Her one weakness, which is mine and my wife's weakness also, was buying purses. While searching for her person to do life with, Crystal got married a couple of times, and even though the marriages didn't work out, they did yield her the precious gifts of two sons, Corbin and Mason. Crystal took her role as a mother seriously and dedicated her life to her children. Then, in January of 2017, Crystal's life took an unexpected turn. It started when her furnace went out in her apartment. The maintenance man for the building, a man named Tony Jones, came by to fix it, while also making quite the impression on Crystal. Tony turned on the charm and swept Crystal off her feet, and the two eventually got married. Tony and Crystal moved into a house in Goodwill, Louisiana, a small unincorporated community on Highway 2 that runs right through the parish seat of Oak Grove. Oak Grove is a small incorporated town of around 1,400 people and about 40 minutes from Crystal's hometown of Bastrop. Initially, Tony promised Crystal the world and made her feel loved, which in reality was all she had ever wanted. Someone to love her as fiercely as she loved them. She had thought that finally, at almost 40 years old, she had found that in Tony. But over time, she would come to the realization that she didn't really know him at all, and that all he gave her were empty promises and lies. Tony had a not-so-great past. He had been married previously, and after they split up, his ex was granted a restraining order against Tony. Their son was also listed on the restraining order because of some violent occurrences that had happened during and after the marriage. Tony's ex stated in her complaint that during one incident, Tony came to her house and started beating on the door, demanding to be let in. When she refused to let him in, he threatened to break down the door and hurt her. During another incident, Tony actually had his hands around her throat and was strangling her. He only stopped when his own brother pulled him off of her. Sounds like Tony loses his temper quite easily. Tony also has a daughter, Hannah Cheyenne, whom he has had custody of since she was an infant. When he and Crystal got together, Cheyenne was around 9 or 10 years old. Crystal loved the little girl as if she was her own. But there were things going on between Tony and Cheyenne that caused Crystal to give them some major side-eye. He made Crystal to be the disciplinarian, while he played the lenient parent, letting Cheyenne do as she pleased. Whenever Crystal would try to discipline her, Cheyenne would run to Tony, who would always take her side. Also, as time went on and Cheyenne progressed into her preteen and teenage years, there were physical interactions between Tony and Cheyenne that just didn't seem appropriate for a father and a daughter, and it didn't set well with Crystal. The last disagreement that they had regarding Cheyenne happened shortly before Crystal's death. Cheyenne had been caught having Snapchat conversations with an older unknown man, and it was more than conversations. She had actually sent the guy nude photos and videos. And that's still not all. The man had tried to meet up with Cheyenne. Crystal didn't think that Tony had handled the situation correctly. She didn't think Cheyenne should be on social media at all. But Tony didn't seem to have a problem or see the danger in anything that his daughter was doing. Between tension when it came to Cheyenne, financial issues, suspected infidelity, and the fact that Tony was intrigued and interested in the swingers lifestyle, which upset Crystal, their relationship was far from perfect, and on several occasions it seemed like Crystal was ready to move on from her marriage to Tony. In fact, the night Janet and her siblings told Crystal's mom that she had passed away, she told them that Crystal had been done with Tony and was getting ready to leave him. In 2020, Crystal and Tony opened a karate studio together in Oak Grove called Inner Peace Martial Arts. Tony had previously been a deputy for the West Carroll Parish Sheriff's Office. In some southern states, you can be a patrol officer or a deputy without going through the police academy, which is what Tony had done. After being a deputy for a year, he decided he was going to complete the police academy, but he quit after 2 days. So, at this point, he had plenty of time to put into the karate studio. Crystal, who had been working for State Farm for 4 years, quit her job to help out at the studio full-time. For a couple of years, things were going good, at least when it came to the karate studio. But then something happened. Towards the end of 2022, just a couple of months before Crystal's death, a vast number of parents withdrew their children from the studio, putting Crystal and Tony in trouble financially. So, what happened to cause this? Well, Tony had been accused of being inappropriate with young girls before, after, and even during classes. Another worker at the studio had noticed that Tony seemed to focus only on the girls when doing stretching exercises. This person also said the way he did the exercises with the girls was very inappropriate. He said that Tony would have the girls lay on their back. He would then lift one of their legs and bring it up over their head. While in that position, Tony would kneel and place his knee into the girl's vaginal area and press into it. This man is a sicko and shouldn't be around young girls ever. And how in the hell has he had custody of his daughter? I don't understand. And neither does Crystal's family. After this sudden financial loss, Tony contacted Crystal's previous boss at State Farm and asked if she could have her job back. The manager said absolutely, and Crystal's coworkers were happy to have her back. During this time, Tony started making extra money on the side by doing maintenance work. This brings us to February 9th, 2023 at 4:44 p.m. Jana had just gotten home from work and barely had time to put her things down when her phone rang. It was her brother, Dane. He told Jana that he had just gotten a phone call from Tony, informing him that Crystal was dead from a gunshot wound and that it was a suicide. This didn't make sense to Jana or Dane. Their sister had plans for her future that she was looking forward to. There had been absolutely no indications that she was in this kind of mental space. They were not only confused and heartbroken, but they were in shock. When Dane told Jana that the police were at Crystal's house, she didn't give it a second thought. She knew that she needed to be there. She needed to see with her own eyes what had happened. It would normally take 35 to 40 minutes to get to her sister's house, but this time it took her 16 minutes. When she arrived, the first thing she saw was the crime scene tape around the house. She then saw a couple of police officers walking around the property, along with the coroner, Lewis Carter. Tony's family was also there, standing back watching everything like it was some sort of cheap entertainment. Jana walked up to the property, and almost immediately, Tony came over and gave her some sort of half-ass hug and said with no emotion in his voice at all, "It's a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head." Jana was speechless. How could he say that so calm and matter of fact? Also, how could they know that already when she had just been found and there hadn't been an investigation yet, that this was a suicide? As Jana walked closer to the edge of the crime scene tape, she overheard Lewis Carter whisper something to Tony. What he said sent chills down her spine. "We still have to send her body off for an autopsy." What did he mean when he said still? Had they initially been talking about not doing an autopsy? In the same stoic manner that he had when he first greeted Jana, Tony walked back up to her and had the fucking audacity to ask her where she wanted to have Crystal's services at, Oak Grove or Bastrop. They hadn't even brought Crystal's body out of the house yet, and he thought this was the appropriate time to start talking about funeral arrangements. Jana did answer him and told him Bastrop, but her tone of voice let Tony know that he was a disgusting piece of trash. After this, things just kept getting stranger. Lewis Carter leaned over and whispered to Tony that they would be bringing Crystal's body out soon. Tony then turned to Jana and said, "You don't need to see her like this." Jana, by this point, was sick of Tony's shit and felt like something was definitely way off with the whole situation. She turned to him and said, "Like what, Tony?" The asshole then walked away without saying a word. It seemed that Tony's entire family had shown up by this point, and law enforcement was busy chit-chatting with them and Tony. Tony's daughter Cheyenne approached Jana. She hugged her and simply said, "My best friend is dead." No tears, nothing. Just matter of fact. Only two of Tony's family members came over and spoke to Jana. One of them, Tony's sister Sherry, tried to tell Jana how sad Crystal was and that her medication regimen was the reason for her committing suicide. She had the nerve to say that the signs were there all along and that no matter how many silly memes she sent her, she just wouldn't laugh. What in the hell is wrong with people? This woman acted like she knew Crystal better than her own sister did. Sounds to me like she was someone who liked to insert herself into things that had nothing to do with her. Immediately after this encounter, they began to bring Crystal out. That's when Angie, another woman from Tony's family and a complete angel, came up and grabbed Jana's hand and said, I know you don't know me and we aren't family, but you don't need to do this alone. Do you know who didn't come over and talk to Jana? Law enforcement. That's who. In the 35 to 45 minutes that she was there, all of the officers were talking to Tony and his family on a first name basis, but no one acknowledged Jana. They never even bothered to ask her who she was. Jana left Crystal's house that day with an unsettling feeling. Tony wasn't acting right, and the whole scene at the house had just been weird. Jana and her siblings didn't believe that Crystal had taken her own life. She had too much to live for. Just the week before her death, Crystal had told her mother that she was going to be a grandma for the first time. Her oldest son, Corbin, who lived in New York, and his fiancée were having a baby. Crystal had talked about buying baby clothes and how excited she was to hold her grandbaby for the first time. This doesn't sound like someone who was ready to take her own life. It sounds like she was planning for the future, not planning to end it. Later on in the evening of February 9th, while Jana and her siblings were giving their mom the news of Crystal's death, Tony made his way to the sheriff's department for an interview with the chief investigator, Alan Irby. He must have taken the scenic route because it took him over 40 minutes to drive 12.2 miles. When he finally got to the sheriff's office, they started the interview, which lasted a total of 7 minutes. Yes, you heard me right. 7 whole minutes is how long Chief Irby interviewed a husband whose wife was found shot to death in their bed, a husband who was the last one to see and speak to her. I have never heard of a case where in this scenario, the spouse wasn't initially the prime suspect until they could rule him out. They are always the first person law enforcement looks at, and then they can follow the evidence from there. But in this case, that was never done. Not Tony nor anyone else was ever a suspect because law enforcement had already made up their mind about what had happened within an hour and 45 minutes. Irby states this in the beginning of the interview when he starts the recording and says that he'll be taking a statement from Tony in reference to a self-inflicted gunshot wound involving his wife, Crystal Jones. So they found Crystal between 4:30 p.m. and 5 p.m., and by 6:45 p.m., at the beginning of the 7-minute interview, they had already decided that the gunshot was self-inflicted. How? They had not done a complete investigation yet because it had been less than 2 hours since she was found. There were no tests done on the gun at this point, or ever, as we will find out. No interviews with Crystal's friends and family members to determine her state of mind, no talking to the neighbors, and no looking at computers or cell phones. Nothing. Was it because Tony had worked for the West Carroll Parish Sheriff's Department? And because he had worked for them, wouldn't their involvement in this case be considered a conflict of interest? Irby had also made comments insinuating that he had known Tony for at least 20 years. And there was proof on Facebook of Heather Irby, Alan Irby's wife, liking Tony's post. In fact, when he made the post on the Karate Studio's Facebook page announcing Crystal's death, Heather reacted to it with a heart. Something else that was rather odd and highly suspicious was the fact that West Carroll Parish was handling Crystal's case at all. Crystal and Tony's house, where her death occurred, is on a state highway, not on a parish road. So the state police should have been the ones handling the case from the beginning. But as we will find out, West Carroll Parish refused to let the state police be involved in the investigation at all. So, what did Chief Irby and Tony talk about during this 7-minute interview? Well, Irby asked about Tony and Crystal's activities on that day. Tony said that when Crystal woke up that morning, she hadn't felt good, so he suggested she call and make a doctor's appointment, which she did. This appointment was for 2:30 that afternoon. Crystal went on with her morning, and at 8 a.m., Tony left the house to head to Bastrop. He was going to the home of a man named Darrell Billings to do some maintenance work for him. He was at Billings' house for a couple of hours and then left to head back to Oak Grove at around 10 a.m. 10:06 a.m., Tony said he called Crystal. The way Tony described the call, it was an awkward conversation to say the least, which we will discuss in a second. Tony said that he stayed on the phone with Crystal for around 15 to 20 minutes. He stated that he had another job to do at Forest High School, but first he went and deposited a check into the bank, and then got something to eat at the bakery barn. He left there and then went to do the job at the high school, where he stayed until a little before 3 p.m. He said that since he was already there, he went ahead and checked Cheyenne out of school for the day. Mind you, Cheyenne almost always rode the bus home, so was there a reason that he didn't want her to on that day? Was there something at the house that he didn't want her to be the one to find? Tony said he texted Crystal around this time to let her know that he had gotten Cheyenne, but there was no response. He said he then took Cheyenne to Sonic to get something to eat. After this, he tried to call Crystal again, but there was still no answer. He said at 3:45 p.m. he contacted the East Carroll Medical Clinic to see if Crystal had made it to her appointment at 2:30 p.m., but they said she never did show up. He said at that point he was really worried, but instead of racing home and seeing what was going on since he was only about a 15-minute drive from his house, he called Chuck Harris, who was an old deputy friend and neighbor, and asked him to do a welfare check on Crystal. When he got to the Joneses' house, he said Crystal's vehicle was there, but that she wasn't answering the door. Tony then gave Chuck permission to go into the house, telling him that the door was unlocked. He told Chuck that her name was Crystal and then gave him directions on how to get to the bedroom. So this guy didn't even know Crystal well enough to know her name, yet Tony told him to go into their bedroom? Tony said he could hear Chuck calling out Crystal's name, and then after a moment of silence, he said, "Tony, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but she is deceased." Tony said this is when he rushed home, but he definitely did not rush. It took him 14 minutes to get home from where he was, the exact time it would take if going the speed limit. Irby asked Tony if he was on the phone the entire time that Harris was at his house, and Tony said yes, even though this contradicts Chuck Harris's statement, which we will talk about in a minute. Irby then asked Tony where he was at this time, and at first he tells him that he was at the bowling alley near their karate school, but then changes it and says he was at the karate school because they had classes that night. He said he had been waiting for Crystal to get there, and when she wasn't there by 4 p.m., he panicked. Tony said he was worried because Crystal had been dealing with depression, and that was what her appointment was for that day. He said she had been taking Abilify, but that her doctor had cut down her dose. Chief Irby then asked Tony how Crystal had sounded on the phone when he had called her at 10 a.m. Tony never did tell him how she sounded, but went on to say, quote, "It took her a couple of rings to actually get it, and I was like, she was like, hey, and I was like, hey. I said, what are you doing? She was like, I was in the living room, and I was like, oh, okay. I was like, it sounded like you were asleep. And she was like, no, I wasn't asleep. I was just in the living room. So, and I talked to her. We sat on the phone for a few minutes and she wasn't really saying anything. 'Cause I talk to her while I drive a lot. And I talk to her while she's driving and I was like, "All right. Well," I said, "I'm going to get off of here. You can get back to what you were doing." And she was like, "Okay." And I was like, "I love you." And she said, "I love you." That's the last time I talked to her. End quote. All I got from that is that Tony likes to say like a lot. This whole conversation just sounds completely made up, and it might have been. We don't know if Tony actually talked to her at 10 a.m. because his phone was never looked at. Irby then asked Tony what guns were available in the home that Crystal would have had access to, and he stated there was a 9mm and a .45. He asked Tony what he did for a living, and he said maintenance. He added that he did all the air conditioning and refrigeration for the school system. He then asked if Crystal was right or left-handed, and Tony answered right-handed. And that was the end of his interview, and was the one and only time he was ever interviewed. Now let's talk about a couple major issues in this 7-minute interview. First of all, one of Tony's main alibis for the day is being at the high school working. This can't be true because school systems do not allow private maintenance workers to come in and work on things. Tony's LLC license had been revoked for 4 years at that point, so therefore he wasn't insured. The bookkeepers at the school would not have been able to pay him with a check, or the auditors would have found out and the school would have been in big trouble. So what was he doing at the school that day? And second, let's go back to when he called Chuck Harris to go in the house and look for Crystal. Irby straight out asked Tony if he had been with Harris on the phone the entire time, and he said that he had been. But that is not what Harris said in his statement. According to Harris, Tony called him and asked him to go to the house and check on Crystal. They then hung up. When Harris didn't get an answer at the door, he called Tony back again. This is when Tony told him the door was unlocked and that he could go in. A few minutes later, Harris called Tony back again and said he had found Crystal deceased. So Tony had not been on the phone the whole time. Why lie about something like this if you have nothing to hide? The next few days after Crystal's death, Tony did some really shady shit. On February 10th, Tony called the State Farm office that Crystal had worked for and asked the manager about a $63,000 life insurance policy that he believed Crystal had obtained while working there. He was definitely not happy to hear that because she had only been back to work for 3 weeks, that she hadn't been added back onto the policy. Tony seemed to not want to take no for an answer, and on February 13th, he came to the office in person with the excuse that he was dropping off work shirts of Crystal's and asked them once again about the policy, and they once again gave him the same answer. On February 13th, Tony made a post in reference to the future of Inner Peace. He said that they would not be continuing classes any longer because of Miss Crystal's passing. Also on February 13th, Tony made a Google search. How long before it was acceptable to go on a date after your spouse had died? He wasn't writing this 4 months after Crystal's death or even 4 weeks. This was 4 days after she died. On that same day after Tony got done asking Uncle Google when he could start dating again, he and his father, along with Jana, Dane, and his wife Julie, all met at Cox's funeral home in Bastrop to talk about funeral arrangements. The representative of the funeral home was a man named Todd Nevels. Nevels was actually from the Oak Grove location, but came to the Bastrop location at Tony's request. It didn't take long to figure out that when it came to Crystal's death, Tony only wanted people from Oak Grove involved. Also, Todd Nevels and Tony knew each other before planning Crystal services. Tony had not only done some maintenance work for Cox's funeral home in Oak Grove, but had done work at Neville's own home. During the meeting, they discussed the fact that Crystal had no burial insurance and decided to do the visitation and the service on the same day. They discussed the cost, and Tony told everyone that he had gotten donations from the community to help cover these expenses, and that he was going to look into getting a loan to cover the rest, making it sound as if his wife was an object. Jana spoke up and said that her sister would not want to be someone's debt, and that she would take care of the rest of the costs. Neville suggested making a GoFundMe to get help with funeral expenses, but Tony said he had no clue how to go about doing that. So Jana said she would take care of it and that she would use her own personal bank account to create it. This GoFundMe account would become a point of contention and lead Tony to making some real douchebag moves. Then Tony announced something that shocked everyone in the room. He was going to have Crystal cremated. This really hit Jana and her brothers hard. They knew this was not something Crystal would have wanted, and they didn't want it either. It made them wonder why Tony was so dead set on cremating her. On February 14th, Tony's first Valentine's Day without his wife, he moved back into his house and made a very cringy Facebook post, stating that it wasn't as bad as he thought it would be, with the hashtag Long Road Ahead. Also on this day, two of Crystal's coworkers collected food items to take to Tony, as people often do when someone has lost a loved one. One of the coworkers, Anna, volunteered to be the one to bring the items to Tony's house. During an interview, this is what she said happened that day. Anna spent about an hour at the house, then decided to leave because she felt uncomfortable being there alone with Tony. On her drive back home, Anna began to receive text messages from Tony that included some very suggestive and sexually explicit language. Tony texted Anna that his dick was hard, and he is still a man and has needs. Tony Jones asked Anna Lewis through text if Crystal ever spoke to her about their sex life. Anna was appalled at the way Tony was talking to her. He knew she had a fiancé, and then there was the obvious fact that his wife had just died 5 days before. Anna erased the text thread so her fiancé didn't see it. Also on the 14th, Tony contacted the funeral home. He said that he wanted to come and see Crystal in the casket dressed with her hair done and in full makeup as soon as possible. Well, the funeral home couldn't just drop everything and cater to Tony's demands, and he sure as hell wasn't going to help find someone to do her hair and makeup, or even give them an outfit for his wife to wear. In fact, when they asked Tony for some of Crystal's clothing to dress her in, he told them he had already packed it away. So the funeral home contacted Janet and Julie and asked them to take care of these things. And they did. They did Crystal's makeup themselves, spending hours at the funeral home, making sure it was done to perfection. Julie spent hours and hours at the store looking for the perfect outfit that Crystal would have loved and buying it with her own money. Julie also found a hairstylist to whom she paid to do Crystal's hair. All of this was done to accommodate Tony. And guess what? The piece of shit didn't even show up. Even though Tony didn't show up, it was still a good thing that Janet and Julie took care of getting Crystal prepared, because while doing so, they found some very concerning things. First of all, they noticed an abundance of bruises all over Crystal's body. When they brought them to the attention of the funeral home director, he told Julie none of these injuries would be the result of an autopsy process. He then told Julie to take pictures of the injuries. There were abrasions and lacerations on her left forearm, along with bruising and more bruising on her hand. Crystal had a fresh manicure, yet her fingernail on her left ring finger was missing, and there was dirt and debris underneath the others. And there was extensive bruising on her legs and in her thighs. Bruising doesn't happen post-mortem, so Crystal had to have been alive when this happened. On February 16th, Tony did something really ballsy. He finally showed up to see Crystal, even though it was a day late. But he wasn't alone. He had a female, quote-unquote, friend with him. Charles Evans, the funeral director, who knew Tony very well, told him that bringing a female that isn't related to you to view your wife's body was not appropriate. So, Tony then had her wait outside. According to Jana, Crystal knew who this woman was, but they were definitely not friends. Anytime this woman's husband would go out of town, something in her house would just happen to break, and she would call Tony to come. This led Crystal to be suspicious that she was one of the women that Tony was having an affair with. This led Crystal to be suspicious that she was one of the women that Tony was having an affair with. At 5:46 p.m. on the evening of February 16th, Tony called Dane to let him know that he had just found the shell casing from the gun that killed Crystal. He said he had found it in the bedroom where Crystal's death had occurred. First of all, not one person in Crystal's family had even been told that the shell casing was missing. In fact, they hadn't been told anything about the investigation, if you want to call it that. Second, that bedroom was small, only about 15 by 15, and just a week before, there had been investigators and a cleanup crew in the room. So how did all of those sets of eyes miss the shell casing? According to Tony, he had found it on Crystal's makeup table, which was across the room from the bed, approximately 6 feet away. So how would it have landed there? The next morning, on February 17th, Dane called Jana and told her about Tony's discovery. This didn't set well with either of them and raised a lot of questions about the thoroughness of the investigation. This led Jana to call close to 48 attorneys, along with district attorneys across Northeast Louisiana. She wanted the cremation of Crystal to be stopped. She pleaded her case with each and every person she spoke to, stating that the discovery of the shell casing by Tony should be the probable cause to stop the cremation, since it had been against the family's wishes to have her cremated from day one. All of Jana's attempts, however, were unsuccessful, with everyone stating that Tony was Crystal's husband, and it was up to him to decide whether to cremate his wife or not. On February 20th, Tony had Crystal cremated, just 2 days before the autopsy report was released. What Tony did with the cremation remains puts him on a whole new level of jackassery, but we will come back to that in a future episode. February 18th, 2023 was the day of Crystal's funeral. After the service was over, Tony gave all the funeral material to Jana. The DVD, the guest book, thank you cards, everything. It was as if he wanted Crystal erased from his life and wanted nothing to remind him of her. Something else happened on the 20th that shed a whole new light on Tony and the case. Jana had asked Tony for Crystal's computer. She just wanted to look for any evidence that would help make what happened to her sister make sense. Tony willingly handed over the computer along with the login password. Thankfully, he had no idea what was on that computer, because if he did, he would have never handed it over. When Jana opened the laptop, she couldn't believe her eyes. Crystal had been keeping tabs on her scumbag husband. She was logged into Tony's Gmail account and email and had been for a while. Jana, being the badass little sister that she was, used her technical savviness and compiled a list of emails, saved usernames, passwords to certain sites, browser search history, and a location Google Maps timeline of Tony's phone via his Google account on the day of Crystal's death. And according to this timeline, Tony had lied about where he had been that day. Tony had said he left the house around 8 that morning to go to Bastrop to do some work for Daryl Billings, and was at Daryl's until around 10. So far, that much is true according to Google Timeline, but it changes once he gets back to Oak Grove. He had told Chief Irby that once he got back into town, he had another job to do at the high school, but first he deposited a check at the bank and then went and ate at the bakery barn before going to the high school. But according to Google Timeline, the first place Tony went when he got into town was the West Carroll Sheriff's Department, which he had labeled as work in his phone. He was there from 10:53 a.m. until 11:09 a.m., so a total of 16 minutes. 2 minutes later, at 11:11 a.m., he was at the bakery barn where he stayed for 42 minutes. So there's nothing about the bank in the investigative report. It states that Tony got a haircut before going to the bakery barn. If that was the case, that would have had to have been the world's fastest haircut, as it would have had to have happened between that 2-minute time span of 11:09 a.m. and 11:11 a.m. At 11:53 a.m., Tony left the bakery barn and arrived at Forest High School at 12:01 p.m. This is where Detective Irby says that Tony was all day working, even though, as we already discussed, Tony's license had been revoked for 4 years at this point, and the school didn't allow private maintenance workers to come in and work on things. At 2:43 p.m., Tony checked Cheyenne out of school, even though she normally rides the bus. After this, his driving becomes even more random and strange. It's as if he was just trying to stall time. And if this is true, then why couldn't he go check on Crystal himself instead of having Chuck Harris do it? The drive from the high school to Tony and Crystal's house is only 13 minutes. In fact, he was in this area the whole day after 11 a.m., so he could have gone by at any time and checked on Crystal. After signing out Cheyenne and leaving the school, Tony drove very slowly around Oak Grove, slow enough that the GPS pins him stopping for 7 minutes between 3:03 p.m. and 3:10 p.m., but no address was given. Records also showed that it took Tony 35 minutes to drive the 6.2 miles to Sonic to get him and Cheyenne something to eat. This drive should have only taken him 9 minutes. They spent 32 minutes at Sonic from 3:25 p.m. to 3:57 p.m. Now, in his interview with Irby, Tony said he called the medical clinic to find out if Crystal had made it to her doctor appointment at 3:45 p.m. So if that's the case, he would have made that call while he was still at Sonic. He said he called Chuck Harris immediately after that and had him do a welfare check. He told Irby at that time he was in the bowling alley parking lot near the karate school, and then said he was at the karate school. However, according to Google Timeline, after Tony left Sonic, he went to Walmart, where he was there from 4:03 p.m. until 4:11 p.m., 8 minutes. And he had told Irby that at this time he was at the karate school waiting on Crystal to show up because they had a class that evening. Spoiler alert, it was later determined that there wasn't a class going on that night, even though Tony's reason for not going to check on Crystal himself was because he was in a class full of kids and couldn't leave. At 4:16 p.m., Tony Googled the number for the medical center, which means he didn't call them at 3:45 p.m. like he told Irby. You can't call someone 31 minutes before you even look up the number. At 4:16 p.m., Tony arrived at an undetermined address in Oak Grove, which was located about 1 mile from 705 Constitution Avenue, where he remained for 21 minutes until 4:37 p.m. At 4:51, Tony arrived at his home. It took him 14 minutes to get there from his last verified location on Constitution Street, after being told that his wife was dead. 14 minutes is the exact time it would have took if he went the speed limit. Tony didn't rush at all to get home that evening. With this new information, along with the appearance of the shell casing and the rushed cremation, Jana and Dane knew that they needed to have a face-to-face meeting with Sheriff Scott Matthews to see what he had to say about all that they had uncovered. The meeting was set for February 23rd, but that will have to wait until next week. We will also go over the investigative report, the autopsy report, and the coroner's report, which are full of discrepancies. Jana and Dane's meeting with the DA and the crime scene. For photos and updates in this case, or to request a case, you can check out the Victim's Voice on social media or our website at the-victims-voice.org. Come back next Friday for part 2 of Crystal's case. And until then, stay safe and peace out.